I know you're not coming for Thanksgiving, but we need to talk about Dad's will. It affects you too. The text from my sister Diane sat on my phone screen like a time bomb. I stared at it from my kitchen table in Kalamazoo, coffee growing cold between my hands. My stomach knotted as I read and reread those words, the first direct communication from Diane in nearly 8 months. For 29 years, I'd been Joanna Winters, the family afterthought. The one whose birthday sometimes got forgotten, like last year when not a single call came through. The one whose accomplishments went unmentioned at family gatherings, even when I earned my master's degree with honors while working full-time. The invisible daughter who learned to make herself even smaller just to avoid the pain of being overlooked. I'd spent years trying to understand why my mother's eyes always slid past me to focus on my sister. Why my father's pride seemed reserved exclusively for my brother Michael. Why family photos were taken when I stepped away to use the bathroom. Why Christmas gifts for me seemed hastily purchased afterthoughts compared to the thoughtfully selected presents my siblings received. I'd spent even more years telling myself it didn't matter, crafting a life that didn't depend on their approval or acknowledgement. But 2 months ago, I found the box, and everything changed. I'd been clearing out my grandmother's house after she passed, another family duty nobody else wanted to handle. "You're already there in Michigan," Michael had said on our group call, his voice dismissive. "And it's not like you've got kids or a demanding career to worry about." The fact that I was the only one who'd visited Grandma regularly during her final years went unmentioned. It was day 5 of sorting through decades of accumulated possessions when I noticed something odd about the attic wall. A section of paneling didn't quite match the rest. When I pressed it, testing for stability, it gave slightly. Behind the false panel I discovered while measuring for repairs, I found a wooden box, its brass hinges tarnished with age, filled with letters, photos, and journals spanning 3 decades. My grandmother, it seemed, had been the family's unofficial record keeper. And what records they were. As I thumbed through the contents in the dusty attic light, my hands trembling, fragments of conversations I'd overheard throughout my life suddenly made sense. The whispers that stopped when I entered rooms. The awkward glances exchanged between my parents when I asked certain questions. The way certain topics were forever off limits. The persistent feeling that I was missing crucial pieces of a puzzle everyone else could see. "I'll be there," I texted back to Diane. "Save me a seat at the table." The drive to Harborton took almost 3 hours. It was a small lakeside town in Michigan where my parents had retired 5 years ago, close enough to my sister and brother to see them regularly, far enough from me to make visits inconvenient. I parked my Honda between Michael's gleaming Tesla and Diane's Range Rover. The driveway was full of cars, aunts, uncles, cousins, all gathered for Thanksgiving and now the reading of my father's will. He died 6 weeks ago, and I'd barely been notified in time to attend the funeral. Mom answered the door with a look of mild surprise. "Joanna, you made it. Not 'I'm glad you came' or 'I've missed you.' Just acknowledgement of my presence, like noting a delivery had arrived." "Wouldn't miss it," I said, stepping inside and breathing in the familiar scent of sage and onion stuffing. Some things never changed. The house was warm and filled with the sounds of conversation and laughter from the living room. As I hung up my coat, I touched the small leather notebook in my pocket for reassurance. Inside were my notes, dates, quotes, references to specific letters and photos I'd found. A roadmap for the conversation I'd been rehearsing for weeks. "Joe," my cousin Abby spotted me and came over for a hug. She was one of the few relatives who seemed genuinely happy to see me at family gatherings. "I didn't know you were coming." "Last-minute decision," I said, returning her embrace. "How's Seattle?" "Rainy." "How's the exciting world of research librarians?" "Meticulous." I smiled. My job at Western Michigan University's archives was perfect for someone who knew how to dig for information, how to piece together stories from fragments. Where's everyone else? Living room and kitchen. Your mom went all out, even with everything going on. I nodded. Mom's answer to any crisis was to cook enough food to feed a small army. The living room fell quiet as I entered. My brother Michael recovered first, raising his whiskey glass in my direction. "The prodigal daughter returns." "Nice to see you too, Michael," I said, keeping my voice light. My sister Diane was on the couch next to her husband Todd. "Joe, glad you could make it. We're doing the will reading after dinner." "Perfect," I said. "I'm starving." Aunt Patricia, my father's sister, gave me a stiff hug. "Joanna, dear, how are you holding up?" "I'm managing," I said. In truth, my father's death had affected me less than I'd expected. We'd never been close, and our last conversation had been over a year ago, a brief, stilted phone call on my birthday that he'd clearly been prompted to make. Uncle David, Mom's brother, barely acknowledged me before turning back to his conversation with my cousin Riley. That was fine, he was on my list. As I made my way to the kitchen to offer help, I caught snippets of conversation. "The lake house is worth at least. Might have to contest if he..." Always had a soft spot for Michael. Nobody asked about my life, my work, or how I'd been coping with Dad's death. It was as if I were a distant acquaintance who'd wandered into a private family meeting, exactly as it had always been. But today was different. Today I knew why. Dinner was served at 4. Turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, 3 kinds of potatoes, green bean casserole, Mom's traditional spread. I took my usual seat at the far end of the table, between my second cousin Tyler and an empty chair. "Before we eat," Mom said, standing at her place at the head of the table, "I want to thank everyone for coming. Robert would have been happy to see us all together." Her eyes swept the table, lingering on Michael, then Diane, then skipping over me to land on her brother. Family meant everything to him. I had to suppress a bitter laugh. Family, right. "And now," she continued, "Michael would like to say grace." My brother stood, solemn in his expensive suit, and bowed his head. "Dear Lord, we thank you for this food and for bringing us together in this time of grief. We ask that you guide us as we honor Dad's memory and carry on his legacy. Amen." "Amen," echoed around the table. As plates were passed and wine was poured, I stayed quiet, watching. Uncle David bragged about his new boat. Aunt Patricia complained about her neighbors. Diane talked about her oldest daughter's college applications. Michael discussed the expansion of his investment firm. I ate slowly, waiting. "So, Joanna," Aunt Patricia finally said, perhaps feeling guilty for ignoring me, "what have you been up to lately?" Perfect opening. "Actually," I said, putting down my fork, "I've been doing some interesting research." "Oh?" She looked ready to tune out already. "Family research, specifically. I've been trying to understand some things that never made sense to me growing up." A subtle tension rippled through the room. My mother's hand froze halfway to her wine glass. "What kind of things?" asked my cousin Riley, oblivious to the sudden shift in atmosphere. I smiled. "Well, for instance, why I was never included in the annual summer trips to Cedar Point. Everyone else went, Michael, Diane, all the cousins. But somehow I was always left behind." "You weren't left behind," Michael said dismissively. "You were at summer camp." "Except I wasn't," I said. "Not that first year when I was 8. I was home with strep throat, remember? Mom told me the trip was canceled because of bad weather." I turned to my mother. "But that wasn't true, was it? There are photos of everyone at the amusement park that weekend. Blue skies, not a cloud in sight." My mother's face tightened. "That was a long time ago, Joanna. I'm sure I had my reasons." "You did," I agreed. "You always had reasons. Like why I was the only grandchild not mentioned in Grandpa's will, or why none of you came to my college graduation." "I was there," Abby said quietly. "Yes, you were," I acknowledged with a small smile. "Thank you for that." "What's your point, Joe?" Diane asked, her voice sharp with warning. "My point is that I finally found the answers. In Grandma's attic after she died." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the notebook. "It's quite a story, actually. Should I share it now, or would you prefer I wait until after dessert?" The silence that fell over the table was absolute. My mother's face had gone pale. Uncle David was staring intently at his plate. Michael and Diane exchanged a look I couldn't interpret. "I don't think this is the appropriate time," Mom said finally, her voice strained. "I disagree," I replied calmly. "With Dad gone and his will about to be read, I think it's exactly the right time for the truth to come out. Don't you, Uncle David?" His head snapped up. "What? Let's start with you," I said, opening my notebook. "July 12th, 1994, you convinced Mom and Dad to invest in your foolproof business venture, a chain of sports memorabilia stores, wasn't it? They put in their entire savings, $43,000. Within a year, the business was bankrupt, But somehow you managed to salvage enough to buy that cabin in Traverse City you still own. That's ancient history, he sputtered. Except it's not, because that money was meant for my college fund, specifically mine. Michael and Diane had their education covered by Grandpa's trust, but I wasn't included in that. So when the money disappeared, so did my future. At least, that's what Dad told Grandma in this letter. I held up a photocopy. He wrote, "We'll have to tell Joanna she's on her own for college. It's not fair, but life isn't fair." Mom was shaking her head. "We helped you with community college. For 1 semester," I cut in, "before you decided I wasn't serious enough about my education. But that wasn't the real reason, was it? The real reason was that you couldn't afford to help me, because Uncle David had swindled you." "Now wait just a minute," Uncle David began, his face reddening. "Is that true, David?" Aunt Patricia asked, turning to him with narrowed eyes. I continued before he could answer. "And then there's the matter of why I wasn't in Grandpa's will to begin with. That was quite a revelation." I flipped a page in my notebook. "According to Grandma's journal, you told Grandpa that I wasn't really Dad's biological daughter, that Mom had had an affair." Gasps around the table. My mother stood up so fast her chair fell backward. "That is not true," she shouted. "I know it's not," I said calmly. "But Grandpa didn't. He believed it because you, Diane, told Uncle David that you'd heard Mom confess it to her friend Carol." Diane's face went white. "I never." "You did," I interrupted. "You were 16, and you were angry because Mom and Dad had grounded you for sneaking out, but they'd let me go to a sleepover the same weekend. So you made up a lie, told Uncle David, and he told Grandpa. And suddenly, I was no longer in the will, no longer invited to certain family events, no longer treated like a full member of this family." All eyes turned to Diane, who was shaking her head in denial, though her eyes told a different story. "That can't be right," Mom said, but her voice lacked conviction. "It's all in Grandma's journals. She knew the truth, but she was afraid to cause a rift in the family by exposing it. So she watched, and she recorded, and she kept every scrap of evidence, including the DNA test Dad secretly had done when I was 12. Now it was Michael who reacted, almost knocking over his wine glass. "What?" "Oh, yes," I said. "Dad had doubts too, thanks to the poison Diane and Uncle David had spread. So he had me tested. The results confirmed I was his biological daughter, but by then, the damage was done. The family narrative was established. I was the outsider, the one who didn't quite belong. I looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes in turn. And none of you ever questioned it. None of you ever stood up for me or tried to include me. You just accepted that I was somehow less worthy of love, of attention, of basic family courtesy." Tears were streaming down my mother's face now. "Joanna, I never." "You knew, Mom," I said softly. "Maybe not at first, but eventually you knew, and you did nothing to fix it." "I tried to protect you," she whispered. "From what? From knowing I was being lied about? From having a normal relationship with my family?" I shook my head. "That's not protection. That's cowardice." "That's enough," Michael said, his voice tight. "You've made your point." "Have I?" "Because I haven't even gotten to your part in all this yet, Michael." I turned another page. "Like how you convinced Dad to put the lake property in your name 3 years ago, telling him it was for tax purposes when really you were worried about his health and wanted to secure the property before he died." Michael's face flushed. "That's a lie." "Is it? Because I have copies of the emails you sent to your financial advisor discussing the strategy. Grandma was quite thorough in her record keeping." The room fell silent again. I could almost hear the mental calculations happening around the table as everyone reassessed their understanding of the past, of each other, of me. "Why are you doing this?" Diane asked, her voice barely audible. "I'm not doing anything," I replied. "I'm just telling the truth. The truth that's been buried under years of lies and manipulations. The truth that explains why I've always felt like an outsider in my own family." I closed my notebook and looked at everyone's faces. Shocked, guilty, defensive, confused. "I don't want revenge," I continued more gently. "I don't want to destroy this family. I just want acknowledgement of what was done to me. I want an end to the lies. And I want whatever Dad left me in his will to actually come to me, not to be diverted or managed by anyone else." "The will?" Mom murmured, as if just remembering. We should probably read it now." Yes, I agreed. We should. We moved to the study for the reading of the will. The family lawyer, Mr. Peterson, was visibly uncomfortable with the tension in the room as we gathered around my father's desk. Before I begin, he said, adjusting his glasses, I want to note that Robert made some changes to his will about 2 months before his passing. Michael shifted in his seat. What kind of changes? Significant ones, Mr. Peterson replied, opening the document. I'll start with the standard declarations and move to the specific bequests. As he read through the formal legal language, I watched my family members' faces. They were still processing what I'd revealed at dinner, shooting glances at me when they thought I wasn't looking. Then, Mr. Peterson got to the heart of the matter. To my son, Michael Robert Winters, I leave my collection of watches and the sum of $50,000. Michael's face fell. Clearly, he'd been expecting much more. To my daughter, Diane Elizabeth Carter, I leave my collection of first edition books and the sum of $50,000. Diane blinked rapidly, confusion evident in her expression. To my wife, Margaret Ann Winters, I leave our primary residence and its contents, my retirement accounts, and the sum of $200,000 from my life insurance policy. Mom nodded slightly, unsurprised. To my daughter, Joanna Marie Winters, I leave the lake property known as Pine Haven, including the house and 5 acres of land, as well as the sum of $100,000. My breath caught in my throat. The lake house? Dad had left me the lake house? The property Michael had supposedly already secured in his name? That's impossible, Michael said sharply. The lake house is already in my name. Dad transferred it to me years ago. Peterson looked up from the document. That's not accurate, Michael. While there was paperwork drawn up, it was never filed. Robert came to see me approximately 10 weeks before his death and explicitly stated that he wanted the lake property to go to Joanna. Why? Diane demanded. Mr. Peterson hesitated, then continued reading. I make this bequest to Joanna with full knowledge that she has been unfairly treated by members of this family, myself included. In my final months, I came to recognize the injustice that was done to her through no fault of her own. This is a small attempt to right that wrong. Additionally, I know that Joanna alone will preserve the property as our family gathering place without selling or developing it for profit. I couldn't stop the tears that welled in my eyes. Dad had known. Somehow, at the end, he had known and tried to make amends. There's a personal letter for you as well, Mr. Peterson said, handing me an envelope. Robert asked that you read it privately. Michael was on his feet now. This is ridiculous. Dad wasn't in his right mind at the end. We can contest this. You will do no such thing, Mom said, her voice unexpectedly firm. Everyone turned to look at her in surprise. Your father knew exactly what he was doing. She looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in years, and he was right. Mom, Diane began. No, Mom cut her off. What Joanna said at dinner, much of it was true. I didn't know everything, but I knew enough. I convinced myself I was protecting her by not confronting the rumors, but really, I was protecting myself from having to take a stand. She wiped at her tears. I failed you, Joanna. I'm so sorry. The room fell silent. Uncle David stared at the floor. Diane looked shell-shocked. Michael was seething, but contained. What happens now? Aunt Patricia finally asked. I took a deep breath. Now, we have a choice. We can go back to the dining room, have dessert, and start the difficult process of rebuilding this family on a foundation of truth. Or we can let this be the end of us as a family. I know what I prefer, but it's not just up to me. I vote for dessert, Abby said quietly, and truth. One by one, others nodded. Even Michael, after a long moment, gave a curt nod. I made pumpkin and apple, Mom said, her voice steadier, and there's ice cream. 3 hours later, I sat alone on the porch swing, bundled against the November chill. Inside, the family was still talking, painful, honest conversations happening in small groups throughout the house. I could see them through the windows. Diane and Todd huddled on the couch, her gesturing emotionally as she spoke. Cousin Riley showing something on his phone to Abby. Uncle David sitting alone at the dining table, staring into space. The dessert had been both awkward and cathartic. We'd eaten mostly in silence at first, the only sounds being forks against plates and occasional sniffles. Then, slowly, the questions had started. How had I found Grandma's box? What else was in it? Did I have copies of everything? The family wanted to see the evidence, not out of disbelief anymore, but from a need to understand the full picture of their own history. "I'll bring everything next time," I'd promised, the words "next time" hanging in the air like a tentative bridge being extended. Now I needed a moment alone to process everything that had happened. How quickly decades of family dynamics had shifted. How years of pain had been acknowledged. How the truth had finally broken through the carefully constructed facade we'd all been living behind. I pulled Dad's letter from my pocket and opened it with trembling fingers, the paper crinkling in the cold air. "Joanna, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I hope you can forgive me for the years of distance between us. I believed a lie, and by the time I knew the truth, pride and habit kept me from making things right. Two things changed in the end. First, your grandmother told me everything on her deathbed. She made me promise to read her journals, which I did. Second, I saw how Michael planned to develop the lake property once it was his, luxury condos where our family home has stood for 3 generations. I know you'll preserve Pine Haven as it should be, a place for family, for memories. Whether the others deserve to share in it is for you to decide. I wasn't the father you deserved, but I was always proud of the woman you became despite us, not because of us. Strong, principled, independent. The lake house keys are in my desk drawer, in a box marked with your name. It's yours now, to use as you see fit. With love and regret, Dad, I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into its envelope, my vision blurring with tears. The porch door opened with a creak, and Mom stepped out with 2 mugs of hot chocolate, tendrils of steam rising into the night air. "Mind some company?" Her voice was tentative, almost shy, so different from the confident, dismissive tone I'd grown accustomed to. I shifted to make room on the swing. "Not at all." She handed me a mug and sat down, pulling her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. For a few minutes, we just sat in silence, watching our breath cloud in the cold air, the distant sound of waves lapping at the lakeshore, providing a gentle rhythm. "I've been trying to understand," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How I let this happen. How I could have failed you so completely." I stared into my mug, watching the mini marshmallows slowly dissolve. "It wasn't just you." "No, but I'm your mother." Her voice broke on the word. "I should have protected you. Instead, I went along with it all. I told myself it wasn't that bad, that you were fine, that you were strong and independent and didn't need the family attention like Diane did or the approval like Michael did." "And now?" I asked quietly. She turned to look at me, really look at me, her face lined with regret. "Now I see that I was lying to myself, making excuses, taking the easy way out." "I don't know if you can ever forgive us," she finally said, after another long silence. "I don't know either," I admitted, "but I'm willing to try if you are." She nodded, a single tear tracking down her cheek. Day by day, hour by hour if that's what it takes. Inside, I could hear Diane's voice raised in an emotional conversation with Uncle David. Michael had left shortly after the will reading, slamming the front door hard enough to rattle the windows, but not before awkwardly telling me he'd call me tomorrow to figure things out. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "What will you do with the lake house?" Mom asked, changing the subject to something less raw. I sipped my hot chocolate, thinking about Dad's letter. "Keep it in the family. Make new memories there. Better ones." I paused, then added, "Maybe host Christmas this year, or a summer reunion." "I'd like that," she said softly. She reached over hesitantly and took my hand, her fingers cold despite the warm mug she'd been holding. This time, I didn't pull away. "I read somewhere once," I said after a while, "that the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. Being treated like I didn't matter. That was the hardest part." "You matter, Joanna," she whispered. "You always did. I just didn't show it. But I want to, if you'll let me." The porch light cast a warm glow around us as the swing gently rocked back and forth. For the first time in my life, I felt visible to my mother. Seen. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning, fragile and tentative, but real. I thought of the box in Dad's desk drawer with my name on it. Keys to a new future, one where I had a place at the table, one where the truth had finally set me free. And maybe, just maybe, set my family free too, from the web of lies they'd been tangled in for so long without even realizing it. In exposing their secrets, I hadn't just reclaimed my place in the family. I'd given all of us a chance at something authentic, something true. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But as I sat there with my mother on that cold November night, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time when it came to my family: hope.